All right. I think we were going to have a couple more people rolling in over the next few minutes, but we can go ahead and get started. Everyone who's here on time, thank you so much. Thank you, Annie and Patrick. We're really excited for today's session. Before I hand it over to Annie and Patrick, just a few housekeeping things. If you aren't already part of the Startup CPG Slack, make sure you jump over there and join. We have a little over 13,000 people in that Slack channel now, which is crazy, but it's a great place to get connected with the rest of the community, get questions answered, that sort of thing. If you're not already on 𝐀𝐿SEN Viser, today is a great chance to get a taste for the platform, understand how the capabilities work, but also right now there's a QR code up that lets you get the Startup CPG access, which is 3 free reports. So I'd encourage you guys to take a look at that. And yeah, with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Annie. Oh, one other point, I apologize. Try to use the Q&A feature within Zoom. It helps us manage questions as they come in. I'm going to go ahead and let Annie and Patrick take it away, but I will interrupt occasionally to surface questions as they come up. So please ask your questions as they come up throughout the session, and I will do my best to represent the audience to Annie and Patrick. With that, Annie, I will let you take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining. Today, our session is called Speeding Up Success, and it's really going to be focused on understanding velocity, what velocity means, how do we use it, what does that mean to bring to a buyer, how can I pick out those golden nuggets to find the story that really resonates with my buyer to get me on shelf or expand shelf distribution. So excited to have you all here today. I'll turn it over to my colleague Patrick to introduce himself, and then I'll intro myself, and we'll kick into the content.
Hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Doherty. I've been with 𝐀𝐿SEN for about 10 years now, and I lead our grocery business acquisition team. I look forward to talking with all you guys and dive into velocity a little bit.
And I'm Annie. I also support our grocery sweets and snacks clients on the ongoing side of the business. So Patrick is more so focused on our net new businesses, and I focus on supporting our ongoing clients, Viser clients, any NIQ clients today. All right, so our topic today, velocity, but let's take a step back. How do we drive sales? What's the easiest way to drive sales? We're all salespeople here. How do we do that? First and easiest way is be where your consumers are. Be where your consumers can find you, and that is on the shelf. So how many stores you're in and how large those stores are drive up your distribution and ultimately your chance of selling more of your product. Percent ACV and other distribution metrics can help benchmark your growth and how your competition's doing. So in the consumer goods industry, our shelf space is everything. That is gold. So knowing where you stand makes planning for your growth so much easier. So before we talk all things velocity, let's take a step back, understand distribution and the different metrics that reflect distribution, and how understanding this will play a big part in understanding velocity. So on my screen here, we've got 3 of our top distribution metrics. So we've got store counts, percent ACV, and TDP. So we'll start with store counts. This is our simplest metric. Think of it as a door count. Simple, broad, easy way to measure distribution. It's the true number of stores your product is being sold in. Then jumping over into percent ACV. This is also called all commodity volume. This is a distribution measure with a weighted methodology. So this means the more volume a store does, the higher weighting it will receive, which will translate into a measure where store doors are not all equal. For example, distribution at a Walmart will have a higher weighting than, say, your local grocer, but it will be weighted, and so your distribution will be reflective of where your sales would be. And then finally, TDP. TDP is helpful to understand both reach and breadth of distribution. Think back to the ACV fact. That really focuses on reach. It captures the amount of the market an item is reaching based on the weight of the store selling it. So having 1 item or 100 items on the same shelf is going to result in that same percent ACV, because that same percent of the sales in the market are being reached. However, on the flip side, this is where TDP is really impactful, because we can look at the number of items on the shelf and how that factors into our total distribution points. So it's calculated by actually totaling the ACV of each item. Additive, so as we can see in this example, you can have a TDP higher than 100%. So let's now start about even understanding what velocity is. Velocity, how fast products are moving, how fast they're moving relative to distribution. So they both impact sales. You've got that little chart on the right-hand side where we can see, sales is that top piece, but the two factors that really impact that sales number are your distribution and your velocity. So those multiplied together equal your sales. So translate that formula just a bit, and we've got our velocity metric is sales divided by distribution. So clicking into some of these velocity metrics, I know this is very metric definition heavy, but will actually help when we start to see the data in real time. So this first velocity metric we'll walk through is sales per million. So dollars over dollar million ACV. This metric looks at, for every $1 million of revenue where your product is located, how many of those dollars are from my product. So I like to think of this sales per million metric as a bucket of marbles. If there's 1 million marbles in my bucket, how many of those are my sales, are my marbles? Then we'll jump over to dollars over percent ACV, also called sales per point of distribution. This measures the dollar volume sold in a market for each point of ACV that market holds for a particular product. So it really looks at the rate of which a product moves through that store. So there's a couple of use cases for this specific metric. It could be an estimate of what sales would be if you had full distribution or even gained incremental distribution in a selected market. You can use it to compare sales rates across competitors, across products, at varying levels of distribution. Or you can use it to equivalize your brand sales position. So this would assume that all brands have equal retail availability. It factors out any of the stores where your ACV is not scanning the product, so you can equalize across your brand and your competitors. We'll take an easier one. Units per store per week. A little bit simpler. This is truly just a measure of, for each store where I have sales, that's that store count metric, how many units on average do I sell per week? A little bit easier there. And then finally, we've got our dollars over percent TDP. And this is sales per point of TDP, and it measures sales per distribution point. So for every 1% of TDP I have, and remember, TDP is that additive ACV. Where are my sales attributed to that 1 percentage point? So this fact can be used to compare small or new items to larger products, where maybe they have that advantage on distribution, or could be used to estimate performance if distribution's increased as well.
Any quick question. Do you find there to be, any single gold standard as to what the velocity metric is, or is it very dependent on the use case?
It's very dependent on the use case. This actually leads us right into our next slide, kind of our best, good, better, best scenarios with our metrics. A lot of these have a lot of caveats, especially looking at comparing across markets. So if you were to compare Whole Foods to Walmart, Chicago to Memphis, all things are not equal in those. You've got something really large and maybe something a little bit smaller. So Patrick, I'll turn it over to you to kind of dive into use cases for all of these metrics.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we can cover a lot of questions about velocity because a lot of the definitions do get a little bit complicated, a little bit in the weeds, but ultimately there are a few key use cases for, when a lot of the brands will start to dive into velocity metrics. And I think this first category that we're looking at, which is those, we're equalizing for distribution, is a really big one that we see with a lot of clients that are in that emerging space. We hear all the time, I can't compete against some of these folks that are much bigger than me. They have so much more distribution. How can I go in and make a pitch that I belong on the shelf against someone who's doing 10 times the volume that I have, or 10 times the distribution that I have? And that's one thing that a lot of these different distribution metrics are great at. It's basically taking a look and saying, if all of us had the same level of distribution, how well am I doing with the space that I have, or the distribution that I have? And all of these are really great tools. And I think one of the things that we see a lot of small brands use is that dollars per store per week, or units per store per week, as a foundational metric. But if you look at the chart here, you can show that the light blue check marks mean, oh yeah, you can use that as a gauge for that, but it's not ideal. And the reason that it's not ideal is because, as Annie had alluded to before, it's not taking into account the size of the store. If I'm in 15 Whole Foods and I say, here's my units per store per week, or here's how many dollars per store per week I'm getting in, and I want to then start taking a dive into Walmart's or Target's, where there's doing a lot more volume, where there's a lot different shopper, it doesn't account for that difference in store size, which can, especially at a channel level, if I want to take a look at sales overall and see how am I performing from a velocity perspective versus my competitors, you're not accounting for those distribution differences. One brand that's heavily in a bunch of stores that are smaller, or only in convenience, or only in drug, versus stores that are much more heavily penetrated in different channels, it can lead to differences in that weighting, and make some of those comparisons across distribution a little bit more complicated. The other ones are great for equalizing for distribution because they all are using a weighted distribution metric as that denominator in the equation. Again, the denominator being the distribution piece. What's my sales doing in relation to my distribution? Comparing across markets is where there's a really big differentiator here. And it's one that a lot of folks struggle with. And I think a lot of folks erroneously will start to use some of the velocity metrics that they're currently using to make some of those comparisons. But one important thing to note when looking at some of these different metrics is, what is that measurement of how much distribution I have? If we're looking at your sales per point of distribution, which is that top one, dollars divided by percent ACV, that's saying for every 1% of distribution I have, how many sales am I bringing in? 1% of Walmart's is not the same as 1% of Walgreens, or 1% of Kroger's. You can't compare these across markets. The numbers won't relate. This is where something like a sales per million, which has that fixed denominator, it's saying for every $1 million of sales that takes place in stores I'm distributed in, how am I doing here versus another location, or a different store, a different channel, different market, whatever it may be. We'll get into the depths of how to do this in a little bit, but just to kind of get that top level, sales per million is the gold standard for measuring across markets, identifying where you're strong, where you're weak in velocity when the markets aren't the same. Again, dollars per store per week, you can do this, but it's not the greatest metric, just because, like we mentioned before, one store Walmart is not equivalent to one store of a mom and pop shop. There's just so much more volume moving through a Walmart. It doesn't lead to a great comparison, but you can do it. Forecasting is another great, here with dollars divided by percent ACV, or your sales per point distribution. It's very easy to do. Again, we'll get into how to do that in just a moment here. Sales per TDP, it's very easy to do. It's not as easy to do with a sales per million, because unless you know the all commodity volumes of every store, it gets too complicated. So we tend not to recommend that one for that use case. And again, dollars per store per week, you could say I'm averaging 15 units per store per week right now, but then you go to a completely different market with completely different consumers, different assortment on the shelf. It can be very difficult to extrapolate that accurately. The gold standard for forecasting measurement from a velocity standpoint is in that sales per point distribution and that dollars over percent TDP. And then benchmarking, you can use all of them, which we'll get into as well. So we can go into the next slide to start to get some ideas of how to use some of this information and how to start to dive into some of the data. And I think one of the things that ultimately we like to get across to our clients and what we tend to like to see in the marketplace, and a lot of retailers like to see, is to be able to tell your story with data. Ultimately, that's one of the biggest use cases for data, is understanding the dynamics of the category, understanding and being able to convey a message or that story about what you guys are doing on the shelf, and putting a compelling sales story together. And we do see with a lot of clients out there, and especially in that emerging space, where they don't have, you might not have full-time analysts that are in this stuff every day. You get your hands on some data, they'll rank their brands and 1 through whatever, highest dollars to lowest dollars, and say, look, I'm number 7 in the category and I'm up 15.5%, as is the case with brand K here. And that's great, but it's not diving deep enough to be able to truly understand what's happening in this category, what's happening with this brand specifically, and how to position it against potential other core competitors. In this instance, just to give some background here, we can see brand K, I know it's a little bit difficult to read because it's small, they are up 15.5%, which is outperforming the category by about 2%, which is great. So there's an outperformance story there. But we encourage you to dive deeper and start to take a look at dollar growth is outperforming the category, while their unit growth at negative 3.2% is underperforming the category. Typically, when you see dollar growth outperforming, unit growth underperforming, you know that the price changed faster than the category did. So we see an increase in price growth there. We also can see a distribution growth, where we're taking a look at that percent ACV metric and seeing that our distribution was actually down quite a bit. But our velocity growth, our same store sales growth, is up significantly. And these are 2 big pieces that I would highly encourage folks to start really using, start leveraging, to truly understand the dynamics of what's going on in the category. How is my distribution growth and velocity growth interacting with each other? How is my velocity growth compared to other, the growth of other core competitors? In this case, with this brand that's number 10 or 11 in the category, their velocity or same store sales growth is growing at about 30.8%, which is a rate that most of these other brands above it are not, even close to that level of growth. We'll get into some of those levers that you can pull and push to increase that growth, or where some of that relationship exists. But another piece to start to take account of is what that raw velocity number is. So you can see with brand K here, and we've masked all the brands just to hide, make sure that we don't get too caught up in the brands that we're looking, but this is real data for the cookie category. For every 1 percentage point of ACV they have, or of distribution, they're bringing in $1,790,000. So they have this ACV distribution of 23.1. If you simply divide their dollars sales by their percent ACV, every 1 percentage point, they're bringing in 1,790. You can then see that for the competitors above. So you can take a look at a brand H. For every 1 percentage point they're bringing in, or that they have distribution, they're only bringing in $997,000. There's a clear outperformance in velocity. And in fact, it's quite substantial how much better they're doing in terms of core revenue or sales with the space that they have, compared to a brand that does a lot more volume, almost double the amount of volume, but they're about half the amount of velocity. Their same store sales or what they're selling per that level of distribution that they have is substantially less. And we'll dive into the importance of that in just a moment here. You can go to the next slide here. So part of understanding that velocity figure and understanding velocity growth and understanding, how do I start to change that velocity? If I feel like I'm low in velocity, or I'm how do I understand deeper what's impacting that velocity? How do I improve it? What are the different levers you can pull to change your velocity? One of the big ones is promotion. So if we remember that brand K in the previous slide was up 30% from a velocity standpoint, is that because they just put on some big promotion and are starting to promote more, which increases that velocity, increases those trials? So you start to see that big push up in velocity. Is their competitors' promotional strategy change? Have they decreased their level of promotion? We also see big velocity shifts with distribution changes. If you are a natural brand that's primarily sold in some natural spaces and you get into a bigger retailer, can you expect the same level of sales when your distribution completely shifts. Also, if we do see rapid changes in distribution, and this is often the case with a lot of emerging brands where they're you're growing your distribution by 100% every single year, you're going to naturally see some of that velocity growth not be as strong because a bigger portion of your total sales is coming from new consumers that you haven't been able to build a loyal base with yet. So if you do start to look at your distribution or your velocity figures in the data that you have access to, and you see, oh, my velocity growth isn't that strong, but your distribution growth is way off the charts, there is a natural relationship there. Same with if you lose a lot of distribution. If you're declining in distribution fairly rapidly, some stores, you had some trials in some stores and they ended up not moving forward with you in a permanent shelving location. Sometimes it's probably because it was a lower velocity store that now is off the books and your velocity can increase. So keep in mind, this is all different puzzle pieces that kind of fit together, different levers that come together. Same thing with assortment. Are there new items on the shelf? Am I getting more or fewer facings? Are there, new flavors or new trends happening with the assortment that's present? That can impact your velocity. Pricing, with inflation, different price changes. Is my competitor raising prices faster than me? Am I raising prices faster than my competitor? Different macro trends in the economy. Some categories are really impacted by that shift to e-commerce, others not as much. And then consumer shifts. If I am going to new markets that have completely different consumer groups that I'm used to selling to, that can be a big thing. Is my loyalty changing with the consumers? Is different purchasing habits exposing themselves based on different things that I'm doing out in the marketplace? That can all play a role. I think I saw a question there.
Yeah, I was just going to highlight that. Can we talk a little bit about what it means to have a change in facings or shelving location?
Yeah. So, one of the pieces with our distribution metrics is they don't typically actually capture facings, which is how many spaces you have on the shelf. If there's an item where you just have one spot on the shelf, that's one facing. The consumer sees one spot. Some products you'll see you have two facings where there's two different products on the shelf, which can create a dramatic increase in velocity in some cases, even though you're not necessarily seeing the distribution metrics reflect that. You could have just one SKU in the store. You just have the SKU in two different shelving locations right next to each other. They have two facings. That's not going to be reflected in your number of stores. It's not going to be reflected in your percent ACV. It's not going to be reflected in your percent TDP because it's still just one SKU in the same number of stores. You're just getting more locations on the shelf.
Awesome. Thanks. Also, if you guys don't mind, I'd love to maybe do a quick exercise using some of the data on the last slide. Patrick, the question to you would be, or Annie, if you are brand K and you have a meeting coming up with your buyer, what are a couple things that you could pull out from this data and throw on a slide that would help make a compelling pitch as to why you deserve more distribution based on the data that you're seeing here?
It's funny you asked that. It's actually on the next slide that we're planning on going to.
Amazing.
Yeah. So, and if you go to the next one. So this does get a little bit math heavy, and I wouldn't worry too much about the math piece of this. But here, this is a key example of where you can start to tell that story. So we have brand K. It's the same data as on the previous slide. We can see brand K, they do about $41 million a year. We kind of went through those metrics of what their performance looks like. And we see a target on the shelf. You could do this at an item level. You can do it at a brand level. In fact, I tend to recommend doing it at an item level. But let's say brand I is ripe for the taking. You say, hey, they make a competitive product. I think I can outperform them. I want to go to that buyer with a very specific recommendation. And we do tend to recommend that when you do go to a sales pitch that you have a recommendation, not just on where your product goes, but what comes off. We see a lot of buyers being a bit risk averse and not knowing their category perhaps as well as they did 15 years ago. Buyers are shifting categories every so often, and going and being able to tell a story of, hey, I belong on the shelf, and don't just, I'm not just going to leave it to you, buyer, to decide all on your own what comes off. I can start to identify some of those targets on why I deserve more space than brand XYZ, whatever it may be. In this case, we've identified brand I here, where we can see, again, looking at just the dollar volume, brand I does about 75% more volume than brand K does. They do $75 million a year, but brand K does only $41 million a year. Brand I has 75.2% distribution in this market, where brand K only has 23.1%. So they're distributed almost 3 times as broader than brand K is. This is where we can start to use the velocity to identify that target and tell a story on why I belong on the shelf more than they do. And that's where we start to peek over at this velocity area. In this case, we're using sales per point of distribution. And we can take a look at, for every 1% of distribution I have, I'm bringing in $1.7, $1.8 million. They're only bringing in $992,000 for every 1% point of distribution. This is where the magic of this type of measurement can come in. And just know that this is a little bit oversimplified just to kind of tell the story. There's obviously some more factors. And again, this is just one piece of the puzzle. But because that $1.8 million for brand K, their velocity is $1.8 million, is for every 1% of distribution, we can basically transplant those numbers and say, hey, buyer, what if brand I had the same, or what if brand K had the same level of distribution as brand I did? How many dollars would I be bringing in if I had 75.2%, distribution, or what would my incrementality be? So we can start to identify a gap in terms of what those different ACVs would be. So the current ACV of brand K is 23.1. We could say, what if we forecasted that we went up to 75.2, the same level as brand I? That's a 52.1 point gap, a 52.1 point gap, which we can then just simply multiply by our velocity and show an incrementality of $18.6 million, meaning if brand K was in place of brand I, it'd be bringing in $18.6 million more dollars if they were able to keep velocity constant. If they're not able to keep velocity constant, then it can't. And obviously with distribution growth, it takes some time to build that loyal base and those repeats. But there are some powerful ways to start to tell that story. And this is how you can start to really compete with some of those bigger brands. Again, not as a brand as a whole, but especially if you're just using item level detail and you're going after a specific item. Hey, buyer, I see chocolate chip cookies are outperforming oatmeal. Here's an oatmeal SKU that I would like to, that I think I should replace with my chocolate chip because you're under distributed with chocolate chip cookies. How much more velocity are we bringing in versus my competitor if you put me in that place? So it's that equalizing for distribution and then being able to extrapolate that out and put an actual figure on what is the potential growth there, or what is that potential prize for reaching up higher. Another great use case for this, and we see this a lot of people using store count for this, and why units per AC or units per store per week or dollars per store per week aren't necessarily always my favorite. But if you say, hey, I'm looking at a total US picture of all my distribution, I know that Publix makes up 2% of the total market. If I were to get full distribution in Publix, what is the size of the prize there? I could simply multiply my velocity times 2%, and that would be my expected prize at Publix if I can maintain that same level of velocity. So it's a great forecasting tool. It's great for equalizing distribution across different brands and competing up, which most emerging brands tend to be doing. And I'd recommend, obviously there's guidelines. You want to stay within a competitive set for the most part. You don't want to go swinging for Oreo right off the bat, but you can definitely swing higher than, only those other brands are at the same level of distribution as you guys, or around the same level of volume, dollar volume.
This is an awesome framework, Patrick. This is something that I've used in similar ways in many buyer meetings. And it's great to be able to show the buyer such tangible feedback and such a grounded in data reality of what you can bring to the table as a brand. It's awesome.
Yeah, definitely. We can go to the next slide. So that's kind of using it to equalize, I think it's usually a great spot for, and I see there's a question there. Can you explain more when you would use sales per point distribution? Yeah. So we're going over sales per million a little bit here. So with sales per million, you can't really do what we just did as easily, because it's all based on $1 million of revenue of a store. Unless you know the total all commodity volume or the total revenue that a store does, it's going to be very difficult to extrapolate that same thing out. But you can do the same thing from saying, hey, look, I'm outperforming brand or item XYZ on a velocity standpoint using sales per million. You just can't always put that exact, here's the exact incrementality it would be if I were to replace that item or have that same level of distribution, whatever it may be. But where sales per million really shines and why it can be a very powerful tool is exemplified on the example in front of you. Sales per million, unlike sales per point distribution, can be used to compare across markets. So what you're looking at in front of you is cookies, and this is live data again, ranked by market for a current year to date week ending 5/20 or May 20th. If we were to take a look at this using a sales per point distribution, the figures that you would get wouldn't be necessarily relative to another. You couldn't compare them, because what 1% of sales in Greensboro is very different from what 1% of sales is in Nashville. But because this is taking everything on a constant denominator basis, it's for every $1 million, how many dollars are going to cookies? We are able to make those comparisons across markets. In this case, you can see in the United States of the XAOC or all outlets combined markets that we have, Greensboro is the market with the highest velocity in the United States that we measure. They don't have the highest sales. They don't have even the highest growth from a dollar perspective, or even growth from a velocity perspective. But for every $1 million that goes into stores in Greensboro, the highest amount is allocated towards cookies in that market. And you can see that ranking from here, Greensboro up top, we go down to Dayton at the bottom of these top 15. These are all strong markets for cookies, but we just took the top 15 here. How this can impact you quite strongly is if you are looking at what's my velocity look like at Whole Foods compared to what it looks like at Target, you're able to make that comparison. And if my sales per million in Target is 100 and my sales per million at Whole Foods is 900, I would know that my velocity is stronger at Target. And you can start to identify, what is it about Target that's making my product move faster there? Do I have better assortment conditions in that space? Is my pricing better? Is is the consumer just a better fit in this market? And you can start to diagnose some of those issues. Same with if you look at your number across a total market, in what we would call our XAOC or total FMCG market, which is the aggregate of all stores in the CPG universe. And I have 100 sales per million across that total US marketplace. And I can see stores that are under 100, and I can see retailers that are above that 100 mark. I know which of my retailers are outperforming that velocity level, which retailers are underperforming that velocity level, and where I might need to concentrate on bringing that velocity up a little bit using some of those levers we talked about earlier. So it's a very powerful tool, which makes sales per million. A lot of people will say sales per million is the gold standard for pure velocity measurement, just because you are able to do some of that diagnosing and you can use it pretty much across all the different levers. It's just a little bit more difficult to forecast with and is a little bit more difficult to calculate on your own. We can go to the next one. The next point, and this is another really useful one, is looking at sales per point of TDP versus just your sales per point distribution. So again, sales per point distribution is that dollars divided by percent ACV. And again, percent ACV, especially at a brand level, is going to be just measuring how broadly is my brand distributed. And is my brand in this store? Yes or no? Is my brand in this store? Yes or no? But it's not accounting for how many SKUs you have on shelf in those stores. this is a really good example that highlights why it's important to have this type of metric. Again, this is real data. We just masked the brands. So I'm sure you could probably guess when we're looking at the cookie category, what we're looking at from a brand A. But using that same brand K example, again, we have for every 1% of ACV, we have $1,800,000 coming in for brand K. We have 14 million coming in for that number one brand. However, TDP takes into account how many SKUs you have on the shelf in those stores. So if we start to, to provide some clarity, if we're looking at an item level, TDP and percent ACV are the exact same. At a brand level is where this really makes a difference, because it's summing up the percent ACVs of all the different items. Using the dollars divided by percent TDP instead of percent ACV gives you a much deeper understanding of what's happening more at a SKU level. And using this, we can see that for every 1 point of TDP, which is basically every 1% of distribution per SKU, brand K is actually almost doubling the amount of velocity that brand A has. So you can see that using the different metrics tells a very different story. It's brand A's sales per point distribution, or sales divided by percent ACV, is so much higher because they have so many more items in store than what brand K does. So this is an example where you can see brand A is number one in velocity when it comes to dollars divided by percent ACV, but they're number 5 when it comes to dollars divided by percent TDP. Again, this huge velocity number is because they have so many SKUs on the shelf. Where brand K, they're number 7 in sales per ACV, but they're number 3 in dollars per divided by percent TDP. So again, I'm not advocating for going after the big boys and trying to take, if you're in the cookie category, and taking Oreo off the shelf, but it's an example that you can start to use, especially at a brand level. If you want to start to target a specific SKU or say, hey, look at my brand, here's a reason why I should have more SKUs on the shelf, which might not be reflected when I do a percent ACV based velocity, but my velocity per SKU is actually higher than that of the number one brand in the country in this case. It's just an example of why each of these different metrics has its own use case, and they're all different pieces of a puzzle that are great to be able to put together and tell a compelling story about why you deserve that space potentially more than others might. Great. Another one, and this is one that's in our Viser platform that a lot of folks, it tells, we kind of do all the math for you by putting together some hurdle rates and benchmarks and things like that that make it very easy to understand, is my velocity where it should be? Is my velocity good? Is it bad? It can be hard to tell because there's a lot of different variables going on, the promotional variables, distribution variables, a whole lot of moving parts to keep track of. This is also using a units or dollars per store measurement. But in this type of report, again, we mask the data to protect the brands. In this case here, is we're able to put different benchmarks together. And you can do this with some of the other metrics as well, but this is the easiest way to do it. Where if you look at the purple box in the bottom right-hand quadrant, that's our focus product, where we can see what's our sales per store for the product that we're focusing on here. We then have the average next to it of all the different competitive products. Products that are brand new, what's the velocity? What's the velocity of products that are in the 20th percentile? What are products that are at risk of being delisted? What is the average of all products? And what are products best in class? So I can start to gauge myself, hey, is my velocity higher than competitive products? Is my velocity higher than those products that are at risk? Or when should I start to be worried that I'm at risk for being delisted? Different things like that. So an easy way to do this, if you're not using like a sales per store or units per store, is just by looking at the SKUs around you, looking at your competitive set. Is my sales per million higher or lower than the competitors in my space? Is my sales point distribution higher or lower than the competitors in my space? But this specific report goes a step further, where we can actually start to measure, do you have does your level of distribution, or does your velocity warrant the level of distribution that you have? In this case, we can see that A listing in the bottom left-hand screen, where there's a little bar charts there. There's and I know it's a little bit small, and I apologize. I wish we could make it a little bit bigger. And you can always feel free to give us a call, and we'll walk you through this in real time with some live data if you'd like us to, with your own brand, just so you can kind of see the story here. It shows that if you're at 100, that means that your velocity matches the amount of distribution that you have. So if you're on one of those brand rankings and you say, hey, my velocity is way higher than everybody else around me, that probably means you deserve more distribution than what you have. And if your velocity is lower than everybody else around you, it means, oh, I better try and really get my velocity up because I might be at risk here. This kind of does that same thing in a modeled way that kind of takes all the work off you and kind of does it for you. So in this case, brand A has a fair share of distribution of 107, meaning that they're over distributed. Their velocity does not match their level of distribution. And this would be arguing that they should either they have to raise their velocity to meet the standard of the competitive folks around them, or they might deserve to lose a little bit of distribution, and just because their velocity isn't strong enough based on the level of distribution that they have. Consequently, if it was lower than that 100, it means there is a very strong story that says, hey, look, my velocity is outperforming my competitors. This model is showing that we deserve more distribution based off that level of velocity. It's a very easy and intuitive way to start to tell a story, very graphically, very visually, with just a click of a button to be able to say, you know, here's what my goals need to be. I need to focus on raising my distribution to meet my competitive products. Or if I'm a brand new product, am I performing along the same lines as other new products? Or do I need to, you know, do I have a compelling story to start to gain more distribution because my velocity is outperforming my competitors? So
Patrick, we've got one question
Sure.
going back to percent ACV, and it's a great question. So, you know, we've talked a lot about percent ACV and percent TDP. How, if someone's on this call and they want to know how to calculate percent ACV, how can they get access to some of that data? I know we've shown some for this cookie category, but if they want to look at the data for their own category or look at the data for a specific retailer, how would they do that?
You could always give us a call and we can walk you through it and show you what we have. Record down for it and kind of give you a peek into what your percent ACV is. It typically is a pretty standard fact for most, you know, in a lot of the reports that we have, percent ACV, percent TDP. It's something that's very difficult to calculate on your own. Essentially, in Annie, you might want to go back to the slide 3, where we kind of show a little bit more in depth on how it's calculated specifically. But and this is an example I like to use because it really, you know, percent ACV is a tough one for a lot of people to grasp. So if you have questions about it, don't feel bashful about coming and asking. We're happy to set up some time with you and walk you through a little bit more. But let's dive into this example a little bit more in the bottom left-hand corner. Pretend that there's only 3 stores in the entire United States. The all commodity volume for that store is the total amount of sales that store does, not that category does in that store, but if store A is a target, how many dollars moves across registers in that target? It's their total revenue for the store. If my product is, and then you can see store, so for store A, we have $30,000. Across the time period we're looking at, they bring in $30,000 across all categories, across everything. Store B, they do $20,000 across all categories in this time period. And store C, store C brings in $50,000 across everything. Again, not related to your product, it's just the size of the store from a revenue perspective. If you have distribution, and by the way, that leads to a total universe, all commodity volume, the total revenue that's coming through those 3 stores in the universe that we're looking at is $100,000. It's simply 30,000 plus 20,000 plus 50,000. This is where the weighting of the stores comes into play, where we can say, store A, they do $30,000 in revenue a year. Am I distributed in that store? Yes. Am I distributed in store B that does $20,000 a year? No. Am I distributing store C that does $50,000 a year? Yes. If we were going by store count, that would bring you to 66% distribution because you're in 2 out of 3 stores. But if you go by size of the store and you say, I'm in the $30,000 of volume in store A, I'm in $50,000 of the store volume in store C, I can say I'm in stores that represent $80,000 out of the 100 in the universe I'm looking at. Therefore, I'm in stores that represent 80% of the total volume in this universe. So my percent ACV would be 80%. So in order to calculate this yourself, you would need to know how much revenue the stores that you're in do. And there's also a time factor to it, which we can go in more in depth with you at that time. But this is essentially how that weighting takes place. It's based on what percentage of total volume do stores that you're in represent across the market that you're looking at. Does that answer your question? I hope.
I think that's a great outline. If you guys have follow-up questions, it's a great time to get them in. And I see a couple questions coming in. One, just real quick to cover up front. Great question. Is there a dollar cost associated with giving Nielsen IQ a call?
No, definitely not. We're always happy to talk with you and kind of give you a demo with some live data, show you what it's all about. Just let us know. We're happy to help. I mean, we won't just give. There are some free reports that you'll be able to get through the QR code on the last slide. You can dive in and start to look at some of those free accounts without having to talk to us. But we're always happy to talk with you and kind of show you what this is all about and kind of give you a deeper insight into what's going on and how to look at this data.
Just, a quick plug from Startup CPG's perspective. So if you guys on the call don't know me, I'm Peter. I lead partnerships for Startup CPG. So, Nielsen's been a longtime partner for Startup CPG. And, one of the things that we've been able to do with this partnership is, get a lot of brands in our community access to data for their brands through both the reports that they get access to through Viser, and I'm sure you guys are going to kind of run through that a little bit toward the end here, as well as the one-on-one opportunities that we have presented. So we have space for about 120 brands a year to meet with Nielsen one-on-one and just have private sessions just going through their own data, even prior to getting signed up to Viser. So I'd encourage you guys to take advantage of that. Even if you're not ready to buy a data package from Nielsen, which many brands in the community aren't at this point, it's a great way to walk away with a couple nuggets that you can then use for buyer meetings. And obviously at some point, the hope is that all the brands in this community will get to a point where, we're using these subscriptions and taking advantage of the relationship that we have with Nielsen. Awesome. A couple other questions that are coming up, and then I know that we're running up close to time. So I'll flip it back over to you guys, and then maybe we'll cover some of these questions toward the end.
Sure.
Awesome. Well, we really are at a good point for questions. This is really our wrap up slide. Really, what does this all mean? What can you do with all of this? I mean, Patrick has done such a great job of diving into all of the reports, all of the different use cases and examples of how we can use velocity, but, really just summing it up in, what can we do here? We can equalize distribution. We can make assortment recommendations. You can benchmark, forecast, plan, give yourselves, give your buyers, give that why behind the numbers. And then at the end of the day, the goal is always advocate for your brand. So with velocity, with distribution, it's always just finding that way to continue to advocate for your brand. And then as Peter mentioned, we have a Startup CPG partnership with Viser, where you can scan this QR code or go to this URL here. And we can give you 3 free reports. They're, category and brand trend reports, top 10, really, really impactful data, gets you using, what this looks like. How can I, for free, kind of play around, see what makes an impact for me. And again, Patrick and his team are all focused on helping you get there, helping you get to the point where you need Viser, getting ready and set up and get your questions answered. And my team is all about supporting you once you're in Viser. So I will say, Nielsen IQ, we are service through and through from today until you are a client. And we are so excited and happy to talk to absolutely anybody who wants to learn about data. We love talking about it. We love talking about Viser. So we are here to help and excited to do so.
Awesome. Well, I'll run through a couple questions real quick. We've got about 10 minutes. So if you guys have questions that haven't been answered, great time to get them in. Let me look through here real quick. So a couple questions about, how to get access to some of the information, whether it be total sales that each store does or sales information, velocity information on a specific category. Annie, do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, so in terms of looking at specific category data, we have a full hierarchy of where items fall within the store. So we can do anything syndicated, we can do really custom work to get you the information that means something to you. We work with clients across the board. So we've done really unique things, segmenting by form, organic, refrigeration status. We can do a lot there. I'm also seeing a question here about how long do I have to download the 3 free reports? I believe it's 6 months.
Awesome. And, Chelsea, to that point, I saw you ask that question. I would suggest signing up for maybe a one-on-one session with the team, because before using those reports, it's always great to kind of get a little bit of education, maybe on what reports are most valuable to you right now. So before spending those credits, I would actually encourage you to take advantage of that time with the team. And
going back to that category piece, even we can give you the recommendation of what you should be looking at, where your products fall within that hierarchy. A lot of times we'll say something that may be called something different within the Nielsen IQ solution versus what layman's term looks like. So we can absolutely help give you direction on that, ensure that you're looking at the right competitors, and give you the tools in the toolbox to be successful.
Awesome. And then Annie, just one other clarifying question.
Yeah.
Nielsen data includes basically the entire hierarchy of the store, correct? Because I saw a question here about, is it just food? Is it shampoo?
Yep, for sure. So we cover, think about anything sold in a grocery store, in a Target. We do have a few pieces that we don't cover, like auto parts, more so non-consumables, but we've got a full beauty team, pet, everything from shampoo to dog food to laundry detergent to ice cream. We categorize within our database and receive all of that information. Makeup, everything's within there.
Awesome. And is it just US data, or specifically there's a question here about Canada?
Yeah, so Viser today is specifically focused in the US. Nielsen IQ broadly is a very global company. We have outside databases beyond Viser. Viser is our emerging brand focused database where it was created with you all in mind. I don't have an analyst. Maybe I don't have the background in data. I need access to a lot of things at a cheaper cost. I need something turnkey with visuals integrated right in there. That's where Viser came in, but Nielsen IQ broadly has a whole host of solutions, fully global. So we can work with our Canadian partners to get any data there. It would look more like reporting in an Excel sheet that we looked at, but still really impactful information that we can help you understand and digest.
Awesome. Calculation question. So if you're selling in 9 out of 10 stores, would you calculate velocity out of those 10 stores, or would you calculate the velocity out of the 9 stores? This is a question from Chris.
Out of the 9.
Out of the 9.
You would only calculate it based off of where you're actually selling.
Awesome.
And the other piece to take into account when you're doing that is also time. So like one of the things that we didn't get too much into, but is very relevant, especially if you're doing some of the forecasting pieces, is, if you take a look at what your sales are over, what time period are you looking at that over. You want to make sure that you're not just doing an arbitrary 52 weeks and dividing it by number of stores, because you're not getting that weighted, 8% ACV, percent TDP take into account that time. Meaning if you're in 100% of the stores in the United States, but only for 6 months out of the year, and you're looking at a 52-week snapshot, your percent ACV would actually show 50 instead of 100. Even though you touched 100% of stores, it was only for half the time period you're looking at. So make sure that if you are trying to do some of this calculation yourself and you have a 10-store group that you're looking at, you've been distributed in 9, make sure you're adjusting the time period to match when you actually had sales there, or even looking at it a week-by-week level and saying, here's my percent ACV in week 1 that I had sales, week 2 that I had sales, and you can, average them together, which is basically what our tool would do, the same thing.
Awesome. Another great question here. We didn't really touch on this a lot during this presentation because I think a lot of it was focused on, presenting data to buyers, but how can the data that's in this platform be helpful maybe in working on your product and brand positioning and optimizing for product market fit?
I think a great way to do that is, and it kind of goes back to all those different levers that you have to pull. Like if you are, and this is a big one for people who are growing, especially if you're emerging out of, really local stores and you're starting to get into more, conventional, bigger retailers, and you want to see, I had this really local following in these stores and a lot of people buying it. Now I'm going to a whole new group of consumers, whether it be different demographics or it be different, just people who've never tried this before. That's where being able to measure some of those velocity changes and compare them to each other can be a really good way to start to identify what is that fit. And a big example of that, we meet with a lot of brands at trade shows, and where they are all tend to be focused in a natural channel, and then all of a sudden they say, oh, Walmart's interested, but does the Whole Foods consumer translate? How does that translate to someone who's selling in Walmart? And how do I start to identify if this will be a good fit? We have tools outside of just velocity measurement that will really focus more on that fit, and is this like what different markets are best for that fit. But using velocity, if you're measuring in some stores or some markets where there's different demographics, you can start to identify, is my velocity faster or slower in this market versus that market, which might have some of those different demographics. You might want to start to take a look at, some of the trial and repeat metrics when you're going to some of those different areas and seeing, if I'm gaining some of this new distribution and I'm doing some promotional work, how is that impacting my velocity? If I remove that promotion, how is that impacting my velocity? And look at the brands around you and see, and this is partially where a lot of the use cases, not just looking at your own stuff, but looking at your competitors' performance and seeing what different things they're going through and how that's impacting sales. So if I see another brand that I know is kind of following a trajectory that I want, or you can start to see, oh, they just raised their price. How did that impact their velocity? Oh, they just changed their promotional schedule. How did that impact that velocity? And that's where it's important to not just view velocity in a vacuum. You kind of need that visibility into all those different areas, all those different trigger points, or those lever areas, like distribution, like pricing, like promotion, like assortment, to be able to see how are these different levers really impacting the results of those different lever pulls that are being pulled, not just with your own brand, but with competitive brands, with the category as a whole.
Yeah, and we can even segment the data within the tools by our characteristics or attributions. So even looking at things like flavor, size, any differentiation points, what are you versus what your competitors are, is your differentiation point that you're organic? Do you have really unique flavors? You can even use those to find where velocities are slower, where you can bring more movement into the category, or even say, hey, this isn't something I want to innovate into because the velocities are slower. So really just using that data and the segmentation within it to also make informed decisions.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. I know we're at time. I have one last question, and then I'm going to give another plug real quick. But the last question I have is a technical question around percent ACV again. So do you only calculate percent ACV for a certain store chain, i.e. Target, Whole Foods, or is it for a certain segment, i.e. natural foods?
So absolutely everything. We cover everything within our universe.
Awesome. Perfect. Great. Well, the only other thing I want to just mention is for folks who are signing up for Viser and maybe holding on to those reports, I would suggest signing up for the weekly email notifications. Those don't count against the credits. I read those every week, and they're a great way to keep an eye on what's happening in your category. So just a quick plug. I know that we didn't go in depth around Viser on this call. We'll do that on another call, hopefully soon. But I use those every single week. It's a great way to keep, like a weekly digest of data coming my way, and it actually doesn't factor against those credits at all. So just a quick plug there. Annie, Patrick, thank you so much for the time today. Reminder that this recording will be posted. It'll be on our Startup CPG Vimeo page, but if you've signed up for the registered for the webinar, which everyone here has, you will get this in your inbox as well. So be on the lookout for that in the next couple of days. Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Well, we appreciate it. Thanks all.
Thanks. Have a good one.